This lecture is about the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a structure in the nervous system that extends from the foramen magnum of the skull to the first or second lumbar vertebrae. And remember, the foramen magnum is the opening in the base of the skull through the bone. It provides a two-way conduction pathway that goes to and from the brain, so it carries both afferent and efferent messages. And it's made of 31 pairs of spinal nerves that arise from the spinal cord. And then at the end, there's a structure called the cauda equina, and it's a collection of spinal nerves that are inferior. So it's at the inferior end of the spine towards your feet, not towards your head. So in this diagram, you can see where the spine is located. You can see where it articulates with the brain. And then you can see there's places where these nerves exit the spine. And so those are those pairs of nerves. And they extend all the way up to the cervical vertebrae. So there's cervical spinal nerves and thoracic spinal nerves. And in this diagram, you can see the inferior end of the spinal cord. So there's also the rest of the thoracic nerves. And then in the lumbar region, there's actually the pairs of nerves start to turn into what this structure is called the cauda equina. The spinal cord is composed of both gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is internal, and it's made mostly of cell bodies. And there's the dorsal or posterior horns and the anterior or ventral horns. So these are sort of projections of the gray matter. And the gray matter surrounds something called the central canal. This is an opening that runs through the spine, and it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And then the exterior white matter is the conduction tracts. So those are going to be like the axons of nerves. And there are dorsal, lateral, and ventral columns. So here you can see a cross-section of what the spinal cord looks like. So the gray matter is interior, so that's here. And you can see that it has these structures that are called horns. So like this is the dorsal or posterior horn of the gray matter, and this is the ventral or anterior horn of the gray matter. And then that central canal, that opening that runs through the spinal cord is here. And then the white matter surrounds the gray matter. The covering of the spinal cord is called the meninges. If you've ever heard of meningitis, that's the inflammation of the meninges, and it can cause a lot of damage. It can be bacterial or viral. The spinal nerves leave at the level of each vertebrae. So where each vertebrae is also a place where nerves can exit the spinal cord. And then there's structures called the dorsal root, and that's associated with the dorsal root ganglia. These are collections of cell bodies that are outside of the central nervous system. So they're in the peripheral nervous system, but they're cell bodies. Remember, typically the peripheral nervous system is made up of axons. And then there's also the ventral root, and those contain axons. So in this diagram, you can see kind of how the central and peripheral nervous systems are connected to one another. So sensory nerves, for example, collect messages, and they send it to an interneuron that's in the central nervous system. And that interneuron can either go to a reflex arc that will stimulate motor output immediately, or it can send the message up to the brain, and then that message can get processed, and then another interneuron passes the message to an efferent nerve that can exit the brain, and that will eventually head back out to a muscle or a gland. Next, we're going to talk a bit about the peripheral nervous system. So nerves and ganglia outside of the central nervous system are what compose the peripheral nervous system. A nerve is a bundle of neuron fibers. So a nerve is not necessarily one cell. And then neuron fibers are bundled by connective tissue. So you can have a bundle of neuron fibers to make one nerve, and they're held together by connective tissue, not unlike the way muscle cells are held together. So there are several layers of connective tissue that are found in a nerve. So the endoneurium surrounds each fiber, and then groups of fibers are bound into fascicles by the perineurium, and then the fascicles are bound together by the epineurium. So here's a diagram of what that looks like. So the endoneurium surrounds each individual neuron or nerve cell. A bundle of nerve cells is surrounded by the perineurium, and then that forms a fascicle, and then many fascicles are bundled together, and they form the entire nerve, and the entire nerve is surrounded by the epineurium. Notice also that there is in fact blood supply, so there's veins and arteries that feed the nerve cells so that they have energy. Because there can be different nerve cells within one nerve, there's several different types of nerve classifications. So mixed nerves are bundles of nerve cells that carry both sensory and motor fibers. And then there's also sensory or afferent nerves. These carry impulses toward the central nervous system, and then motor or afferent nerves that carry impulses away from the central nervous system. Across the length of the spine, there are 31 pairs of nerves that leave the spine at each vertebrae, and they're formed by a combination of the ventral and dorsal roots of the spinal cord, and they're just named for the regions from which they arise. So just like there's cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, etc., there's cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, and sacral nerves. Remember that bone that's there is called the sacrum. Once a nerve has left the spinal cord, it will start branching fairly quickly afterwards. A branch of a spinal nerve is called a ramus, and they contain both motory and sensory fibers. And then when they divide, some of those nerve fibers go to the dorsal side of the body and some go to the ventral side of the body. And so those are called the dorsal rami and the ventral rami. And they can serve skin and muscles of the posterior trunk or a plexus or network of nerves for the anterior side of the body. So here you can see where a nerve cell leaves. And so the dorsal root is where it's attached to the spine. And then the root ganglion is a bundle of nerve cell bodies. And then you can see the branches, the dorsal ramus goes to the back side of the body, and the ventral ramus wraps around to the front side of the body to innervate various regions of the trunk. A plexus or a nerve plexus is a network of nerves that serves both motor and sensory needs of the limbs. They form from ventral rami of spinal nerves in the cervical, lumbar, and sacral regions, and there are 4 nerve plexuses. So there's the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral nerve plexuses. Next, we're going to talk about some of the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So we're going to talk about the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. First, we'll talk about the somatic nerves. So these are the ones that serve skeletal muscle, which is the muscles that you have volitional control over. These are a 1-neuron system, and they originate in the central nervous system, and then the axon extends to the muscle that is served. There's no subdivisions, and the neurotransmitter used to send messages from the nervous system to skeletal muscle is acetylcholine. The autonomic nervous system is composed of 2 neurons, and so you have a preganglionic nerve and a postganglionic neuron that are part of the pathway. The effector organs are things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And this can be subdivided further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and it uses a wider variety of neurotransmitters, including acetylcholine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. In this diagram, you can see kind of how those divisions would look. So the somatic nervous system, again, is when you have a single neuron that impacts skeletal muscle. And so those nerves release acetylcholine and activate skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system, again, is divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, and it can impact things like smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle. It uses several different neurotransmitters, and it also uses multiple nerves. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems both originate from kind of different regions of the spinal cord and brain. So the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division originate from the craniosacral region. So there's the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. And then also the S2 through S4 regions of the spinal cord, so that's sacral. And then because of where that is located, this division is also known as the craniosacral division. And then terminal ganglia are the effector organs that they act upon, and the neurotransmitter used is acetylcholine. So in this diagram, you can see the division between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And the cranial nerves that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system are labeled here, so includes like eyes, salivary glands, heart, lungs, stomach, pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. And then the sacral nerves that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system are the nerves between S2 and S4 and include control of things like the bladder and the genitals. The anatomy for the sympathetic division includes preganglionic nerves from T1 through L2, so that's thoracic 1 through lumbar 2, and then the ganglia are at the sympathetic trunk, which is near the spinal cord. Then there's a short preganglionic neuron in this pathway, and then a long postganglionic neuron, and they transmit impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors. And then the neurotransmitters used are things like norepinephrine and epinephrine. So here you can see the sympathetic division. All of the nerves here arise from the thoracic and lumbar nerves, which is different from the parasympathetic, where they arise from cranial and sacral nerves. Recall that the sympathetic nerve pathways always have at least two nerves, right? So there's generally going to be one nerve that leaves the central nervous system and then another nerve that works on the target organ. So there's a junction here. So the peripheral nervous system is divided up into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division is the fight or flight division. Its job is to respond to unusual stimulus. And so it takes over to increase activities. Sometimes it's called the excitement division because it becomes active during exercise and excitement, emergency, and embarrassment. So things that are an unusual stimulus that might cause things like an increased heart rate, sweaty palms, and all of those sort of things. The other side of the coin is the parasympathetic nervous system, and it kind of does more of your housekeeping activities, kind of your calmer activities. Its job is to conserve energy, and it maintains daily necessary body functions. So sometimes it's called the D division, so it's in charge of things like digestion, defecation, and diuresis, all the things that you can do when you're not in an alarmed state.